Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about few tools and techniques I generally use to come up with an architecture diagram. Now this is what one thing most of us does, but I wanted to share it with whosoever is probably coming for the first time into this architecture diagram design world to understand what typically it looks like. Now what I'm going to use here is the Windows Whiteboard, which comes for free as part of the Windows operating system. So I'm using Windows 11, and this is part of that Windows 11. So you can just use the Windows Store and download it and then have it here. Now you can use it, the actual whiteboard and multiple colored marker over there, and then take a picture of that once you're done discussing with that. Now imagine one thing, that architecture diagram is not a one-person activity. You should involve all the people responsible for that application or the workload for which you are going to design the diagram, because each individual has their own perspective and they come from a different background, and understanding of that business can help you identify things. And I have talked about it, how important it is to have uh, a business analyst, a security person, a senior solution architect, um, business architect, technology architect, so on and so forth. So you should bring all of them into one single room or a meeting if it is a global team, and then do this exercise together. Now imagine that I have got few people sitting with me, and what we are trying to do is that we're trying to move a very simple web application which is running today in a virtual machine and talking to a SQL Server database in the on-premises data center to Azure. Okay, so we already know about the diagram in the context of on-premises, so we're not going to draw that. So what we thought, like, because it is a private application, which means only users part of the network will use it, we'll create a network, okay, in Azure first. And inside that network, we can have a SQL Server database, and we can have that application. Let's keep it a very simple that way. Now, today in the on-premises world, both of them are in the virtual machine. Okay, so we can argue that where is the redundancy, etc. So we'll not deal with it now at this point in time, but they are both running in the virtual machine. So we can continue to run them in the virtual machine, and the app reaches to the database sends the response back, all works fine, and because they are all internal users, they can access the application but not the database. So we know that who accesses what kind of thing it looks like. Now this is the typical migration might look like, and there is no, we're not dealing with, let's say, the dependencies like reading from another data sources, integrating with other solutions, etc., which can come. But let's assume that it's a simple standalone application, a website running in a virtual machine, maybe an ASP.NET application, okay, and then it talks to a SQL Server database. Now there are multiple ways by which you can host this application in Azure. Depending on the cost and the approach which companies generally take, you can decide to go with it. Now I've worked with few enterprises, and they have a very defined strategy. So the strategy says that from a migration perspective, because why we are doing migration, that's the question. So the why is important. If the answer to that is that we are not going to renew the data center which we have on premises, we will go to the cloud. Or we have a cloud strategy, so everything runs on premises should go to cloud, right? Either way, And this is a time bound. So this is an important point because let's say you say by end of June 23, we have to do it because July is the day when we need to renew the contract. So we can't really extend that. And if it is a generally cloud strategy, so you define the importance of that application. The less critical application moves generally fast to identify whether cloud really works or not. And then the more critical application goes in the later point in time. So you have identified that. Somebody has identified what is the priority here. So you choose that application and decide to do that. So you are a bit more relaxed in this context. However, whatever that timeline is, there is a timeline. Now, what is the another strategy number two? So this is the strategy number one, which is impacting a strategy number two. Now, definitely, cost needs to be reduced. So we need to reduce the cost. So it should go down. You cannot justify the business if the cost of running the application on premises is less than the cost of running that same application in the cloud. So you have a challenge here. You need to make sure the cost goes down. Now, I have experienced that there are strategies from an enterprise perspective to avoid any kind of changes from a migration perspective. Okay, avoid changes in the application in app code. So no one rewrite want to rewrite that application. Okay, so this is the not the option. That means what we typically call from an application modernization perspective is sort of like deprioritize. Okay, that's not the case with everything. It is deprioritize, which means that we have to carry the application code into the cloud. But there are still opportunities to modernize. By the word modernize, we mean to say that we can use the modern way of deploying things, which can save us the cost. Now, what are those options? Now, one of the biggest cost from an application, running an application perspective is the operation cost. We call it ops cost. People or the team who manages the infra. Okay, infra management. If we can reduce it, if we can reduce it, we will be able to win a lot of cost benefit. So we'll be able to achieve this. So how to reduce that? Use more of PaaS solution, platform as a service, which is the cloud vendor managed thing. So anything goes wrong with the hardware, software, etc., which will be handled by cloud vendor, and that will be controlled by cloud vendor. So you don't have to put a long documentation and a large team to help you support that. Now with this, since we're not able to change the code in Azure, from an Azure perspective, there are a couple of options available. Continue to have the code. You can run the code. So we are considering the app side of the story. We can run it in a VM. Okay, we configure the IIS, Internet Information Services, install the .NET, and then put the app in the IIS as a virtual directory. We have done it 1,000 times. Second thing is that we can take the app and containerize it. Okay, that way we are making sure that whatever the app is, it's inside the container. We just deploy the container, it runs without further configuration because we have tested in the dev box and it works in the dev box. It should work in the production. Now, to run a containerized app in Azure, there are ways which you can do. One is Azure Container Instance. We call an ACI. It's a pool of resources. You can host your own container in that pool of resources. You don't have to install the Docker runtime, maintain and manage things over there. You can use our AKS if it is complex and you already have an AKS cluster available to deploy the container for your enterprise need. You can leverage that AKS. But for single application like this, it is not recommended to set up an AKS cluster, which is a complex process. However, we have a managed AKS, but still you have to take care of everything around that. Third, we have called app services, which is a modern way of moving application in scenarios like this without making changes. It supports container. So in the app services, you can host your container based application and deploy it over there. So depending, now we are discussing, right? Now we are talking to the team like what suits you the most. What is concerning over here at this point in time is not about the capability, because we assume the capability has to be there. The application should run. That's de facto. What is the concerning factor is how much it costs me per month. Okay, the dollar. The lesser the dollar value is, the better it is, obviously, with the reliability in the mind. So it is a big deciding factor. You should not use something which is non-reliable. For example, while you are doing the production deployment, things can go broken, right? If that is the case, then it is not recommended. So reliability is key. So you have to give a balance. So you have to do a balance between these two. So what is important, whether this goes and this. So I'm just trying to know. So it's basically that kind of decision which happens inside the room. So if you look into that Azure, revisit the Azure diagram, right, which we tried to draw earlier, let me put a thing here. We probably will have an Azure running, and um, we will use the app service where we will host a container, which is our application. And this time, we need to keep the container in Azure Container Registry. It's a private registry. We can keep it within the Azure subscription. And whenever there is a need, it basically gets uh, pulled from that ACR and then becomes the container. So that's the app service which we create. From a SQL database perspective, we can also modernize this without making any changes. There are we need to check like what is the kind of um, compatibility looks like. Can this SQL become a PaaS database? So we call that as Azure SQL DB. That's a fully managed SQL Server database, runs on Azure. You get the SQL Server detail. You just dump your data into that. Everything is managed by Microsoft. Um, if you see that compatibility could be an issue, what you can use is a SQL managed instance, MI, which is closer to the on-prem SQL. Hence, you can continue to use the same database without making changes to that. So both way, the modernization in the database is possible. And we always highly recommend that you go for this platform as a service data sources, because database management is a big task, because you not only can be having a data, but you want to make sure it is regularly backed up. What if that database is not available? How do you restore it? What is the RTO and RPO and all this blah 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 stuff, which is the heart and soul of the application. Because if there is no database, even if your application is super solid, rock solid, it will not work. Okay, so database is so important. So you can imagine that, let's say we decided to go with the PaaS, easiest option. We decided to go with an application which hosts my container in an app services kind of mode, because then it gives me an ability to scale the application, um, make it more and more instances if the number of users grows. We need an ACR within the Azure subscription, and then everything looks fine. Now, once we decide all of this, We then start drawing this thing into a Visio diagram. So I can use tools like Microsoft Visio, which is also available. You can start drawing things here. Now, you notice here that this is a licensed product, which means that you need to pay for it. If you, let's say, want to use certain open source tools, you can use tool like Draw.io, which is almost the same. So I like this tool, Draw.io, for personal projects. And then you say Draw.io. It takes one of the social login. So I have used um, my GitHub account, so you can use that. You don't have to remember that. And it asks you what kind of diagram you know and want. So you can see that you can create all these different formats. I say that raw one. I choose the blank diagram, and I will decide what I want to put there because blank diagram is, and then it gives me all the repositories I can store this to, and then let me put it in the TikTok, and then I say okay. So basically, it is going to get saved into my GitHub repo, and then it file will be there in my GitHub. So this is the designer which is available in the browser, right? Now, what is also an important thing is that it gives me a lot of options. It tells me that if I want to draw an Azure, so there are a lot of Azure icons I can get from here. So for example, I have used SQL, Azure SQL, and then if I say Azure SQL, you'll find that database is showing up. There are multiple different options. If you say that app service, you will find that app service. So the different diagram comes in, right? So all these different things will be available to you just in front of you, and you can just use them as part of the diagram. So for example, if I simply drag this database into this, you can increase the size, okay? And then if you deploy this Azure website, which is where I'm going to deploy the website, you can even um, say the container registry. So you can see that there are multiple container instances available, container registries here. So I can bring in the container registry. I can bring in the AKS. It is deprecated, so that's container registry. So you can actually start drawing, putting things into that because you can't use that whiteboard to really work on the real proposal. So you need all of them. So then you need just boxes to cover it up. So you can do all these visual things for free of cost. And I just get these things. So you can do all the formatting, right? You can say that, hey, you know what, I want to put a dotted line. You can edit the style. Uh, you can change the way how it looks like, so etc. All these things you can do. You can even use the arrow to identify like how it is connecting. So for example, if I say that this arrow is going to go here, so let's say I want to, I use this one. hard to hold it. But anyways, you got the idea that you can do all sort of design things from here, right? You can actually do a level arrow. So this is what I like the most. Okay, you can put a level as part of the arrow, and then it basically becomes your kind of indicator that data is flowing through this, and registry is available here. You can edit the text here, and you can say that you can add the separate text just like the visual. So it is, once you're done with it, what you can do, you can just save it and just give a name. I didn't give any name, but you can import it, right? You can say save it, save as, and you can choose like maybe you want to do a PNG or SVG, right? Or even an HTML file you can come out of. So you can save this diagram into different format and put it in your proposal to identify like how this thing really works. So I wanted to quickly share with you how this architecture diagram exercise really looks like. If you see that it can go really complex, because I didn't really consider a complex application. It's a simple one, but I still tried. So while talking, doing a brainstorming, you will be probably writing all of this stuff, and then you finally come up with a diagram which you want to plot it to either Visio or any other tool to make a final look of it, and then proceed from there. What we have discussed here is something we call as a high level diagram. However, once we decide on the high level, then we go into low level, then we do talk about specifics, right? What is the size of the database looks like, how much data it is going to store, how many instances, what is the SKU of that ACR and the container apps looks like. All of this stuff are basically part of the low level diagram. But from a high level perspective, you decide on technology and component and agree, do a review and do a discussion, and then low level follows after that. So with this, I want to thank you. Hope you have enjoyed. We'll come up with many more such examples, which is really what how we work today in the real context.